Alright, I'm not going to bury the lead. I hate finishing. Okay, well, maybe not hate, but I don't enjoy it. If anything, I tolerate it. But it is one of the topics that I get asked about most often, so I figured rather than answering a bunch of emails individually, I'd just make this video. So before we get into it, a couple key things to remember. One, I'm not an expert, so anything I say here shouldn't be taken as definitive or the final word. Instead, I'm somebody probably like you who just wants a finish that's relatively easy to apply and will do what I need it to do. Two, there are way too many finishes to possibly cover, so instead of hitting everything, which I couldn't do, I'm going to focus on two types of finish, and these are what I use 99% of the time. And I'm sure that's what everybody does. You kind of find what works and stick with it. And three, there are way too many variables to possibly hit everything specific to every person. So again, these are just recommendations and what I've gravitated towards during my woodworking career. Okay, all that said, the first step in finishing, regardless of what product you want to use, is sanding. And I know that's not what you came here for, so if you want to skip this, you can just fast forward to this time and you'll get right into finishing. But my number one single biggest tip when it comes to sanding is this: don't rush. Whenever you have a large panel to sand, people's tendency is to want to go like this. But in reality, you should be going like this. I like to do overlapping passes, alternating between going lengthwise and then going widthwise for however many passes it takes until I'm done. Basically, imagine you're mowing a lawn. You wouldn't push the mower in a dead sprint in a random pattern. You'd go back and forth. I guess you'd probably only go lengthwise and not widthwise, and certainly you wouldn't make several passes. Look, the point is, I have fake grass. Anyway, so slow passes, and you're going to start with 60 or 80 grit, and this is where it's going to take you the longest. You might want to periodically check by drawing some pencil marks on your panel and taking another pass, and just keep doing this until everything is nice and level. Then we'll move on to 120 grit, 150 grit, 180 grit, and finally 220 grit. And that's where I'll usually stop. Well, I take that back. For spots that won't get touched, I'm going to stop at 180 or even 150. So for example, take something like this dresser. I'm going to sand the top and the drawer faces and the sides to 220 and everything else to 180 except things like the underside of the bottom and the underside of the top. I'll call 150 good enough. Okay, now I know sanding is boring, but just a couple last things because I think these might really help you. In addition to sanding in a logical pattern, don't push overly hard. And don't tilt your sander. I know it can be really tempting when you feel a high spot to want to dig in and kind of grind away, but don't. And that's actually one of the things that I've come to really like about this sander, the Mirka. At first I didn't like the fact that you have to depress the paddle to make it run. I was used to my old sander which had a switch that you didn't need to hold. But over time I've come to really like it because it almost forces me into using good technique since the pressure I'm putting down is centered over the sanding pad. Okay, this is the last thing, plywood. So all of the same stuff applies, except that usually I'll start with 180 and then go up to 220, or sometimes I'll just start and stop with 220. Basically, you just want to be careful not to sand through the veneer. Okay, now we can get on to finishing. So like I said at the top of the video, there are way too many to cover. Shellac, varnish, lacquer, polyurethanes, water-based, oil-based, and then within those there are endless brands. But at its most simple, you really have two types: penetrating finishes and surface finishes. And for the most part, they are pretty much exactly what they sound like. A penetrating finish is going to soak more deeply into the wood, forming a seal, and leave a much thinner surface coat. Whereas a surface finish, while it's still going to penetrate the wood a bit, is going to build up a much thicker film on the surface with repeated applications. So what are the drawbacks and benefits of this? Actually, before we go any deeper, let's narrow the field. So from this point forward, I'm only going to be talking about the two types of finish that I use on 99% of my projects, and those are simple finish, which is a penetrating oil with a wax top coat, and pretty much any water-based polyurethane that's readily available to me. Now, in full disclosure, I'm probably biased because Simple Finish is a Maker Brand product, and Ben, Mike, and I started Maker Brand. That said, don't get it backwards. I don't like Simple Finish because it's what I made, but rather I made it because it's what I like. Okay, so generally speaking, a penetrating oil is going to have a much more natural look and feel, And I know people use the term stain and finish kind of interchangeably, but really what it's doing is enhancing the wood. In fact, you can usually just wipe some water on a piece of wood, and that'll show you about the color that you can expect from a penetrating finish, minus any hue. Another benefit is it's easier to refinish if needed. If you get, let's say, a scratch a year down the road, you can sand the spot, feathering it out, wipe on a couple coats, and it's good as new. Whereas with a polyurethane, it's going to be a lot harder to fix that spot. That said, the opposite side of that coin is polyurethane is generally a bit more durable, so you're less likely to get that scratch. Or maybe not less likely, but it's just going to take a little bit more. So I guess you can kind of think of them on an inverse scale. The more durable a finish, the harder it is to touch up, and vice versa. And the last major benefit that I'll touch on, and this is subjective, is that I think oils are just a little bit easier to apply, and that leads to better and more consistent results for most people. Now, some of the other benefits with polyurethane are going to be, at least for what I use, it's cheaper by volume, and it changes the color of the wood less, if that's the result that you're going for. Which I guess takes us into the next topic, actually applying things. So let's do that, and then I'm going to talk about when and why I choose different finishes, and hopefully with all of that information, you'll be able to pick what's right for you. For penetrating oils like Simple Finish, I always apply them by hand, wiping them on with either an old t-shirt or blue shop towels. And the exact timing is going to vary based on your environment, temperature, humidity, etc. But generally speaking, I wipe on a coat pretty liberally, let it soak in for about 20 minutes, then come back and wipe on another coat, wait another 20 minutes or so, and then wipe off any excess oil that hasn't absorbed into the wood using some blue shop towels. Then at the very least, the next day, I'm going to wipe on another coat, and again, after about 20 minutes, wipe off any excess oil. Now, you'll find that as you do this, the wood is going to soak up less and less finish, and the more coats that you put on, the deeper the luster you'll get. So at the most, I'm going to do 2 coats on day 1, 1 coat on day 2, and then stop there if I'm happy. But if I want more, I'll do another coat on day 4, and then another coat on day 7. And I've never done more than that. I would say the most common for me is 3 coats everywhere, and a 4th coat on really touchable areas, tabletops, drawer fronts, that kind of stuff. So that kind of takes us to another benefit/drawback between the two. In my opinion, wipe-on oil finishes are less work, but there's more downtime. Whereas a poly is going to be more labor, but there's very little downtime. So you could get on several coats in a single day if you wanted. Now, if you're looking for something to do during that downtime, I recommend getting new glasses. And if you're getting new glasses, I recommend Warby Parker. Okay, now seriously, before you fast forward, yes, this is a sponsorship. We all know how this works. But seriously, I have been using Warby Parker and recommending them to friends since way before I ever uploaded my first YouTube video. So here's how it works. You go online, take a quiz, and they're going to suggest a bunch of frames. Then you pick your 5 favorites, and they'll send them to you at home to try on, and it ships for free, there and back, and there's no obligation to buy, so there's literally nothing to lose. Now, the reason that I think it's important is because the purpose of a pair of glasses, in addition to the obvious of helping you to see, shouldn't be to look good on their own. It should be to make you look good. And something that I recently heard is that you should pick a pair of glasses that contrasts your face shape. So if you have a more angular face, you'd go with a rounder pair of glasses. And if you have a rounder face, get something more angular. Now, I honestly can't tell what kind of face I have. I feel like I'm in between. So I opted for pairs that were round, square, and sort of in between. And then I can make the decision once I see them on me. And once I do, glasses start at only $95, including the prescription lenses. Warby Parker is committed to providing exceptional vision care online and in stores, offering eyeglasses, sunglasses, eye exams, and contact lenses. So if you're in the market for any, I highly recommend checking out Warby Parker. Just go to warbyparker.com/4eyes, or better yet, click the link in the description. Okay, now let's get back to talking about finishes. Now, with water-based poly, you can wipe or brush it on, but I prefer to spray. If you aren't spraying though, the few times that I've brushed it on, I've used foam brushes, putting on several light coats, and making sure to brush very lightly with the grain of the wood. And whether you wipe it on or spray it on, if this is your first time, know this. You're gonna think that you messed it up when you put on your first coat. It's gonna look a little bit blotchy and feel rough, but that's fine. That's how the first coat goes on. And that's because of those several light passes and due to the fact that it raises the grain of your wood. Now again, dry times depend on the environment, but spraying or wiping, you can usually recoat within a matter of tens of minutes, and regardless of the application process, the general approach is going to be the same. So I'm going to spray from here on in. So you put on your first coat, and it's going to look and feel like trash, but don't panic. And I like to get 2 coats on if I'm brushing or 3 coats if I'm spraying, since they're usually a little bit lighter. And then I'm going to wait for it to dry and then very lightly sand with 320 grit sandpaper. I'm just barely putting any pressure down, just kind of gliding it along the surface. And that's going to knock back the raised grain, and you should see a sort of white powder dust film come off. So we'll sand it everywhere, then I'm just going to use my hands to wipe off the powder as best as I can and do another coat. And I'm going to do the same thing, sanding between coats to get a total of 5 to 7 coats on. And when I've got my last coat on, I'm going to take a brown paper bag and rub out the surface to get rid of any little dust nibs that might have gotten into the finish. And that's basically it. So like I said, these 2 finishes account for 99% of the finishing that I do. So the next question is, when and how do I decide to use polyurethane versus simple finish? So here's how. Now, there's no particular order to how I think about these things, but since I can't simultaneously talk about all of them, let's start with plywood versus hardwood. If it's a plywood piece with exposed plywood edges, like for example this giant thing that I built at my parents' house, I'm going to go with polyurethane. And there are 2 main reasons. First, I actually prefer the plasticky feeling that the polyurethane leaves when it's on plywood edges. And second, I prefer the color that polyurethane leaves on the plywood edges, which is almost no color change at all. Whereas oil, especially depending on what the cores of your plywood are made from, is going to darken things and probably not very uniformly. Now, if it's a plywood piece where I'm going to be covering the plywood edges, I'm going to make my decision based on other factors. So the next one that we'll talk about is color. So we touched on this a bit already, but generally speaking, I've got 3 different tones that I'm shooting for on any given piece: dark, medium, or light. And the 2 species of woods that I find myself gravitating towards the most recently are walnut and beech. So if I want a darkish tone, I'm most likely going to go with something like walnut, and I'm almost always going to use oil over polyurethane for that. And that's because it's going to be a bit darker and just has a higher end look and feel. If I'm going for a medium warm tone, I'm usually going to go with a combination of beech and oil. And you can substitute beech for any number of species, but this gives me that sort of warm goldeny color that's probably my favorite at the moment. Now, if I want a really light look, I'm going to choose beech. Again, you can sub that out for other species, and polyurethane. And this will leave the wood much more bare looking. Take this table and chair, for example. These are both beech, and I took these pictures one after another in the same lighting and in the same spot. And you can see here, when you start looking at finished pieces, the difference can become pretty pronounced. The next factor that I'm going to think about is how this piece is going to be used and what kind of access I'll have to it. Now, both of these finishes can be extremely durable. I have pieces in my house that are many years old and have an oil finish that I've never retouched, and they're holding up great. That said, as we talked about before, polyurethane is the more durable. So if it's a piece that I know is going to get a lot of abuse, and I'm giving it away to somebody that's far away, so I'm never going to have access to it, and I know that it's not likely to get any kind of maintenance, I'm probably going to use polyurethane. But if it's a higher end piece that'll only get normal wear, or something that people don't interact with a lot, like a media console, or if it's something that I could imagine them refinishing or touching up if needed after, say, 5 years, or if it's something that I'm keeping at my house, if any of those things are true, I'm going to lean towards oil. And I think that about covers it. You know, I'm sitting here and I'm watching this back, and I want to give some more clear direction. So I guess to make it more clear, what I would base choosing a finish off of would be 2 things. 1, what you like the finished look of, and 2, what you enjoy using. So here's why I kind of had that epiphany. So I'm sitting here at my dining table, and this piece is a few years old and it has a polyurethane finish. And you see this stain right here? This is where my kids used slime on the table. And there's a lot of other like little scratches and markers and all kinds of stuff on it. Basically, it's something that gets a lot of use and it takes a lot of abuse. So at the time that I built this, I was thinking it's gonna get a lot of abuse, therefore I need to use a durable finish. I used the polyurethane, and here we are a few years later, and it's pretty beat up. Basically, it didn't matter what finish I used on it, and I guess that's kind of the point, is it really doesn't matter what finish you use on it. I don't care how strong it is. If it's a piece that's gonna get abused a lot or used a lot, it's gonna start to show some wear. And the opposite of that is true. If it's a piece that's just gonna sit in a corner that's never gonna get touched, you could probably put the worst finish in the world on it and it's gonna stay relatively fine. It's just sitting there. Maybe it's get some dust on it or something. So I guess hopefully that kind of illustrates the point. I mean, now I'm in a situation with this table where I'm gonna have to refinish it no matter what eventually, probably once the kids are a little bit older, no point in doing it now, but it's gonna be a lot harder to refinish it now than if I had just used a penetrating oil. So hopefully that lesson that I had to learn helps you think about things and choose what's right for you. Again, just choose what you like the color of and what you like working with. I think that's the best advice that I can give. Okay, let's go back to the video. And for the 1% of the time that I don't use either of these finishes, it's usually when I'm going for something that's really deep black in color. And so I'll go with a black polyurethane. Okay, so we covered a lot, but we're barely scratching the surface of talking about sanding and finishing. But I feel like this is the 20% or so that covers 99% of my needs. So hopefully it gave you some good information and something to think about so you can make that decision for yourself on your projects. All right, I'll see you in the next one.